My name is Todd Tuttle. I live in Toluca Lake, California, and today I'm going to share my story of growing up a gay man in a fundamentalist Christian background, going to Liberty University, my dabble in ex-gay conversion therapy, and my outreach to LGBT students at religious schools. I grew up actually in Michigan. I was born in Michigan. I lived there till I was 10. And I grew up in a very liberal household. My family, my mom and dad were very open with us. I went to an Episcopal church. I didn't have a really strong religious background. It wasn't until I moved to Florida in 1976 and I went through junior high school and high school that I actually was exposed to a very conservative religious undercurrent. And I was actually in a high school class, and my high school teacher, who everyone adored, asked me to go to church with him one day. And I thought, oh, this is very interesting. So I went to the church, and I was 14, and I was actually greeted by the pastor, who knew I was an artist. So he showed me his art collection, and I kind of felt like it was a family, and I felt like I fit in. And so over time, I went every Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. The pastor knew that I had a gift for sharing stories, and so I started doing sermons from the pulpit and teaching Sunday school, and I just really immersed myself in that culture. And I grew up in Central Florida, so it was very conservative. Liberalism was looked at as a dirty thing, and all this time too, though, I was struggling with knowing that I was gay. I knew I was gay since I was about 6 years old. I just didn't have any words to put to it. And going through that, the pastor was the first person, that I told I was struggling with these feelings. I went through a lot of guilt and shame in trying to pray that, I would change and that this wasn't normal. And I was taught, of course, that this was the time when AIDS first appeared, and it was a judgment from God. So I had to go through that as a young person. It was a very conflicting time for me, but I really did feel like I was fitting in. In particular, too, at high school, I remember there was a keg party in my high school, or in my town, thrown by some high school students, and somebody was murdered at that meeting, or at that party. And so everyone got together in our high school gymnasium, and I remember raising my hand, and I got up and I spoke to the crowd, and I said, the reason why this happened is because we need to get back to God. And the entire auditorium stood up. And actually the next day I was written up in the local newspaper saying that I was wise beyond my years. And so this very conservative religious bent was actually undergirded by my community. And so I didn't think I was doing anything wrong. But if I look back in retrospect, I was really moving away from my liberal, open, loving self, and I was moving into a very judgmental, narrow, if you're not like me, you're not any good, you're not a Christian, you're going to hell. So I started changing my viewpoint, and it happened very gradually. I really believe that because my pastor kind of counseled me that the Bible teaches that, male and female, and that you needed to, push these feelings down, I started dating girls. And so I went through that phase of trying to prove that I was a straight person by dating girls. And I always left them emotionally abandoned because there was no connection. I look back at it now and they thought I was being cruel, but it was actually that I just didn't have that emotional connection with women because I wanted that with a man. And so I didn't really experiment during my high school years. Well, with a few incidents happened that I would say were experimentation, but they made me feel guilty and all. And it wasn't until I went to college that the floodgates were opened, and I went to Liberty University of all places, and I met somebody there who became my assistant on the yearbook staff. As soon as he walked through the door, I sensed and knew he was gay, and there was immediate attraction. And the strange part about Liberty is you weren't even allowed to date unless you were a senior. So they had a lot of strict rules. Literally, if you were a male student and you appeared in the female dorm anywhere, you were expelled. So this whole gay feelings thing was very, very difficult. The only thing that made it easier is we had a dark room, and this person and I could actually experiment, behind closed doors where nobody was there. It brought up a lot of guilt, a lot of prayer, a lot of, oh my God, what have we done? It was really, really traumatic experience for me. So it wasn't until college that I really actually experimented and tried to, figure those feelings out. I really felt at the time that I wanted to study to be a minister. And again, it was because my skill set kind of matched that. So I chose Liberty University, which actually was considered liberal by my church. There's a story I'll tell you of how my mom found out I was gay, and it has to do with this person that I met at Liberty. But my family always they supported me in my ministry and in the church because it was, again, something that the community thought was a good thing. He was a Catholic man, but he really appreciated the fact that I spoke in the terms that I did about God and about, Christ and all of these things. So I actually converted my mom into fundamentalist Christianity, which kind of turned out to be a bad thing when I get to that part of the story. But there was a lot of proselytizing, obviously. There was a lot of witnessing, a lot of trying to get folks converted. And what's funny is I tell this story that when I was a kid, there were no big pink buses taking you around neighborhoods, taking you to buildings and trying to convert you to be gay. But there were church buses taking children around to churches and converting them into their belief system. So my sophomore year, so this person and I, his name is Mark. Mark decided to come home with me during spring break, and he and my mom had been conversing through letter writing and all, and he had a very bad home life, and he thought it was really interesting that my mom and I were close, and so he came home with me during spring break, and apparently we were snuggling up. We fell asleep together and we're snuggling up next to each other on the couch, and my mom came and thought, that's odd. And then the bell went off that I must be gay. She tells the story that when Mark first came into the house, he was effeminate, so he came across in stereotypically way as gay. But my mom thought, it's very nice that Todd's befriended this little gay boy, without any thought that I was gay myself. My mom immediately went to my pastor of the church. After she found us on the couch, she didn't say anything to me, and when she got home, then my stepfather and mom confronted Mark and me, and I just spilled the beans, and I said, yeah, this is who I am, and this is what you found is the truth. I still wasn't convinced that that's what I should do. I just knew that that's what I felt like doing, and it was nice to be close to somebody. Mark's aunt actually lived in Orlando, so they took him to his aunt's house, and then he went back to Liberty, and they pulled me out of school because they thought that I needed to make things right. I was listening to Carpenter's Home Church radio station WCIE in Lakeland, Florida, and this man named Cy Rogers was giving us testimony. And this is the week after Mark was shipped back to Liberty. His story was that he was a pre-op transsexual man who was transitioning to be a woman, but he got converted, and he started ministering through Exodus International, which was the very first organization of ex-gay self-identified people. And the bell ran off in my head, and so I shared it with my mom, and so I decided to go to ex-gay counseling so that I could fix this issue and move on with my ministry and all. The only problem is he really, in our counseling sessions, I found out that he hadn't really changed. He told me how attractive I was. He said, if he was still a gay man, he would have loved to find somebody as masculine as I was, because I didn't, I broke a lot of the stereotypes, and there's nothing wrong with effeminate men, all that. It's just the way that he was coming on to me and the way that he was kind of inappropriately talking to me, it made me feel really creepy. And I've heard other stories where, in fact, even the people that started Exodus International, the couple have said that they've done more harm than good in trying to change people's sexual orientations. I only went to him for a couple months, and then I decided to try the exercise on my own. So I would pray. Very much the biblical model. It's very gender role based, that men are the head of the household, and that women are subservient. I mean, it's that biblical view of male and female roles is really something that they would hammer in. And also that sexuality is a gift from God, and that it can't happen outside of the confines of marriage, and marriage is only between a man and a woman. So basically I started down that path of dating again, girls, and having girlfriends. And the same problem happened, is that, they would get close to me and I just couldn't reciprocate the emotional connection, and it just hurt a lot of people. And it frustrated me because it just wasn't working. They use the AIDS epidemic as a way to say that God's, punishment and wrath is against sexual impurity. And so they really taught that. And so people were scared about doing anything, that was considered a door to getting AIDS. I remember at Liberty, we went to a haunted house that Liberty University put on in the community, and everyone went to it. It was called Scaremare. There was a scene of a man dying of AIDS being judged by God. as one of the horror scenes. My mom really was disappointed in me, which is the first time, because she's always been very supportive. But again, a lot of it had to do with the fact that I had gotten her involved in the religion and in the church, and, she had taken an active role. There's also this story that's peddled in these circles that if you're a gay person, there's no way you can live a happy life. You're going to just be miserable. You're going to get AIDS. My father and I weren't very close. He supported me in the church and all. He was a status quo person, so he would go along with whatever I decided to do. He didn't have a particular viewpoint from a religious viewpoint on the gay journey. My stepmother, though, was very religious, and so that impacted how he dealt with things. The story goes that years later, Mark and I did get back together. We visited California in 1988 after 3.5 years of being apart, and I just thought it'd be nice to rekindle the friendship, because how it ended was very judgmental and very sad. I just stopped talking to him because I thought Satan was using him to get to me, and that's another thing. The whole Satan is a real person, and demons and all these things exist, and they're tempting you to lose faith in Jesus and in God. So that's also part of the fear-based dynamic that you're taught. Over time, I decided that the dating wasn't working, and I saw somebody who was a closeted gay man in my church hide who he was, and it caused disastrous consequences for the people involved, and I decided that I wasn't going to do that. That was the impetus for me saying, I'm going to accept myself for who I am. I'm not going to hide. I'm not going to live a double life. I'm not going to get married and have children just to please a church or my family. I needed to be who I was, because at the end of the day, that's really what mattered. Mark and I came to California in 1988 to rekindle our friendship. It became more than a friendship during that trip. We decided that we wanted to be together. So he lived in Pennsylvania at the time. He came to Florida and lived with me. Our plan was to come out to California, which we eventually did. But I remember sitting in Denny's with my dad and my stepmother looked at us and said, "What you two are doing disgusts me." It's very interesting. A lot of things that I would do as a religious person, conservative, fundamentalist, I thought I was doing in love. You don't accept somebody from being gay because you're enabling them, and this is the way they think, you're enabling them to have behavior that's going to damn their soul to hell. So actually, when somebody from that background says, I'm doing these things in love, it's just a different definition of love than the rest of us have. And I think that in educating people about what's happening in this country right now, I think people project their own ideals onto religious conservative people, like the word love, but you have to understand it's coming from a different context and a whole different framework of belief. And the more we can understand that, the more we can understand, well, how do we talk about this with people that come from that background? Because when I think I love somebody, that means I support them. I'm there to be there, in who they are, supporting who they are, and wanting the best for them. But back when I was in that belief system, the best thing I could do is separate myself from them, like the prodigal son, and hopefully one day they'll understand the error of their ways and they'll come back and ask for forgiveness. So if people are wondering what happens if you're gay and you come out one of those households, you're rejected, you're a lot of times kicked out of the house. Because of that, Mark and I, when we moved to California, he decided to write a book about our story. He grew up in a very much more conservative household, and he was born into. And we started hearing from a lot of people that were still religious students at school that had grown up in this background that needed support. There really wasn't a lot of a support system for LGBT students at religious schools at the time. There was a GLSEN organization that helped people in public schools. So Mark and I decided to start a nonprofit called Heartstrong, and we incorporated in 1997. And for 3.5 years, we drove 220,000 miles around the country speaking at college campuses, at PFLAG groups. There's a lot of shaming that happened. We remember a lot of students were called up in front of school assemblies at these religious schools and outed and shamed to think that would change their behavior. And instead, what it did is it continued the self-hatred and loathing that we all had experienced. Again, a lot of times it resulted in suicide and self-harm. And I don't think people quite understand what happens in these churches and in these schools, because again, the government can't regulate them. That's why, I fight against giving federal funds to these schools, because they do a lot of harm to people that nobody ever hears about or sees. I remember this is at the beginning when the internet first started. I remember being in our Seattle apartment and I saw Mark crying, and I went over to the computer. He was a 14-year-old boy that was in Columbus, Ohio, and he went to several religious schools, and the one Catholic school, he was beat up and he was thrown into a dumpster. His mom pulled him out of that school and sent him to another Catholic school in hopes that it would get better. And he was still being harassed and he was being bullied because they thought he was gay. And his mom went to the school to change it and they wouldn't do anything about it. So he took a gun and walked up to his attic and he shot himself and killed himself, age 14. It was and it's still very, very emotional. It's hard for me to talk about this, but it really touched us because of the religious school aspect. And, we knew we had to do something. That really was the impetus of starting Heartstrong, was that night. And I remember Robbie's mom asked that school that she wanted to start a scholarship fund in her son's name, to raise awareness about bullying. And this school told her to take her political agenda elsewhere. A year after he passed away, we visited his house, and his mom, Leslie, led us upstairs to his bedroom. And I remember opening the door, and it was just as if she didn't change a thing. It's just a year later, it was just as he left it. And we went over through some of his books, and I found some of his school books in a chest, and I looked through the books, and in the margin he had written, "I hate the way God made me. I hate the way God made me." I never want to see that again. I didn't choose to be gay. That's another thing that I bring up, not only the pink bus going around neighborhoods, but I don't know any gay man that I've ever talked to in their journey that says, "Oh, one day I woke up and I decided to be gay." But being a Christian's a choice. I just want everyone to understand that. I did believe that I could change. I did believe I would have a family. I did believe that this would take all of that away, but many, many other people found that to be not true. I would have taken a bullet for my belief system. I really would. I was so brainwashed and so committed to it that I would have done anything for the cause. And therefore, it was a very big struggle. When Mark and I would do something, the very first time we ever had a physical encounter, I pulled away from him and I treated him like scum because I felt like Satan was using him to tempt me. So my behavior towards him was very awful on any standard. And then I also did that self-flagellation to myself. It was a little easier when I didn't have like a person that I had an interest in. So before I went to college, it was a little easier. Although, attraction to like my soccer friends or any of that stuff, it just racked me with guilt. But I never really acted upon it. I was able to not. But the Mark cycle of guilt over those 2 years until I was found out by my mom, that was really, really painful and very, very psychologically damaging. It's just awful. So I was lucky to escape that and actually accept myself. There's a lot of people, like I said, that either live a double life or, decide to do something else, which is, more self-harm. And it's still going on today. Even though we have the internet and we have, all this support, if you're in that bubble, you only hear one message and you're taught that anything that you don't hear, that creeps into your belief system is from Satan. Same thing, it hasn't changed. Same thing, it'll be the same way 100 years from now. There's just so much ignorance about these topics in a lot of religious circles. You see a lot of people, Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, you're born biologically a male. There's just a lot of ignorance, and it's very black and white in how you're taught. They have a very simplistic view of the world. Some of these conversion camps make people dress like girls in dresses, and it's very gender role specific, and they think that by taking a tomboy girl who might be lesbian and dressing them in a dress and having them play with dolls, that actually will impact and change their orientation. It's very crazy, actually. After a while, when I couldn't change, I think it was seeing all the hypocrisy of the other people that were hiding and doing a double life, and seeing just how judgmental everyone started to be. Because when I would share stories with people I went to church with that I was struggling with these feelings, there was a lot of rejection, and I started really feeling and taking a self-reflection and really listening to people telling me that I had changed. And it was a culmination of a bunch of those data points that made me stop and think, well, wait a second. if this is what I'm being told about this, are the other things really true too? Because when you're in a cult, it's very hard to get away from it. And I think it was finally deciding to accept myself for who I was when I saw that man live the duality. And I stepped away from, the church. I started reading books. Somebody said you need to read The Demon Haunted World by Carl Sagan. But I read The Demon Haunted World, and it was really probably one of the most fascinating books that really started me to be a critical thinker. Mark and I would travel around the country and we would share our story. And I'm about, bringing people together, supporting people, loving people, helping them accept themselves. RuPaul says it best, how can you love somebody else if you don't love yourself? That is extremely important. And there's so much self-hate and self-loathing that goes on in these circles. I still share my story. I think when my mom found out about me being gay and didn't realize that and pulled Mark away from me and I started down the ex-gay route, I think that was my darkest hour, because I felt like I really hurt and disappointed her. And I think a lot of us live for our parents' approval. And I really felt like I hurt her deeply. And I think that was really hard. Eventually we reconciled and she was very supportive, which is I was very fortunate in that respect. But it took years. We were estranged for a certain amount of time as well. And I think just the situation with my mom was the darkest and hardest for me. And I think that's a lot of people go through that with their families and the rejection they feel from the families. And I think that was difficult. I look back on that and I'm thinking, having survived that, very much so. My husband, Corey, and I are very happy. And I'm very, very fortunate that I've escaped that. And I'm fortunate that I didn't marry a woman, have kids just to prove that I was straight and then destroy those lives. I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad that seeing somebody else do that and how damaging it was my wake-up call. I'm so fortunate to have seen that.